All right, let's jump into it. This will be 4 daily games that I played with 2 different players. I had white and black in each one of those little mini matches, and let's jump right into it. This one started with a bishop g5 Dutch defense, which I think is kind of my favorite variation to play just because there's a lot of craziness here. If you do this book move to try to chase the piece away, you get this really cool position where you can play e4, not even worrying about the bishop because you have a lot of cool opportunities with possibly queen h5 check. And then on top of that, if you do what he did and I take here, you get possibly a really annoying pawn structure, and this is really similar to what I had in that game where Calvin just absolutely squished me, except the only difference is my pawn was on h6, which is even worse. So I play e4. The threat is I'm going to play bishop h5 or queen h5 checkmate, so you don't have time to take the pawn. You have to find a move for your king to get some space. So potentially you can play a move like h5, or you can just move the bishop out of the way, but he pushed a pawn, and this leads to me winning a pawn because I check, or he moves, and then I check again, and now you have a choice. You can push the e-pawn forward or go back, and he chose to go back. If you move forward, here's kind of a really funny checkmate with queen b5 checkmate. So anyways, moves forward, I check, he moves back the king again, and I say, you know what, it's my turn to move, I need to get out of the way with my queen, but why don't I check him again, because he'll be forced to go to d7. So at least now it's my turn, my queen's not under attack, and his king is in a terrible position. You're going to have to decide what am I going to do with it. So I develop pieces out, he offers a queen trade, and I say I could take, and then his king will take on e8, and then it'll be my turn, but why don't I just check first, because even if he goes back, I'll just take again. And if he pushes the c-pawn, I'll move my queen back to b3, and I'm already in a great position. My queen and knight are over here on this side of the board to pester this king, which is never going to make it over here, and you wouldn't want it over there, so my pieces are already good by every standard. He plays knight c6. Unfortunately, this is an immediate blunder because I pushed d5, and there's no way to simply defend the knight while attacking the queen in a way that works, because even though you play a6, I just take with check first. Sometimes this position will work if, let's just say, your king is back here, and let's just say this queen is actually a bishop. There's kind of a position where you can kind of go crazy and everyone takes all our pieces, but the problem is, since pawn takes comes with check, it doesn't work, and I just sidestep my queen back. Game goes on, I castle, so that when he plays bishop h6, even though it comes with check, I'll actually be able to castle, because if I wait after he plays this move, I simply won't be able to castle. Game goes on. We reach this point, and then I've realized I can safely take the a6 pawn. Now, you might be thinking, well, Aaron, can't you play rook a8, pinning the bishop to the queen? But in that position, I'd be able to take the bishop with check, and then I'd simply be able to move my queen back somewhere safe. So I take, instead of going through that sequence, they just decide to take the pawn. I take with check, then you move up, and here I move the pawn forward, and this basically comes with the threat is you can't take this because of the pin on the rook, and if you take this, then although hold the knight before it comes in, you're going to lose your queen. So, not even the best move. I move back. Okay, now I want to push the pawn forward, theoretically. Move this queen back. You can't quite push the pawn forward here to fork the king and the queen, so I prepare with rook e1, and then queen moves forward. Now here, there's a crazy sequence. This is one of the last things of the game I'll show in depth. I never would have found it, which is knight to d4. And the threat basically is, well, obviously, you got to do something about your queen, and if you just move it out of the way, this pawn's going to come back with check. It's going to force your king to the back rank of the board. It's not going to be great. And you might say, well, what about queen takes e5? The problem with that move is then I have this crazy move. Queen g4 check. If you block with either of these two pawns, I could pick up the rook, and obviously you can't block with your queen because I'll just take it with the knight. But you might say to yourself, okay, well, why don't I just play the counterattack f5? That way you take my queen, I take yours, and we're all happy. The problem is I stick in the in-between move, knight takes f5. And not only am I threatening a devastating discover check, but also your queen is still under attack. So I didn't see any of that, though, and I just took the pawn. We trade pieces off. I stack on the e-file, and if you want to trade off all your rooks, I'm fine with me because I am up a piece. Move the bishop over, then I realize it's pretty easy to go after the f6 pawn, and there's not really a pretty way to defend it. And obviously you don't want to defend it with your king and then allow this discovered check. And so you move the bishop up, and this actually leads to kind of a similar position either way. I play knight c5 check, you take, and you get these ugly triple pawns. Then I check you in the back rank with the rook, and no matter which square you go to, I pick up the bishop. The alternative to this is that if you move your bishop here, it's actually the same position. After takes, I take. Whichever way you move back, you've already lost the bishop. Now maybe this one would have been better because then it doesn't come with tempo when I try to stack the rooks on the g7 and e7 squares, try to get that 7th rank, but nevertheless, that goes on. And there's kind of a really cool puzzle in this position that if you take here, if black moves forward, there's an awesome unstoppable checkmate in 2 puzzle that begins with pawn to c4, which, as we know, is explosive. There's no desperado checks. There's no interesting moves to cover these squares because it's just about impossible to stop. I'll just randomly take a piece. Rook to e6, checkmate. And that applies even if the bishop is over on g7. Obviously, my opponent didn't do that. And they moved to the back rank, and I stacked my rooks. Now, I gotta be a little risky about that back rank checkmate on d1, so I take the pawn first, move the king, and I thought to myself for a long time, how am I gonna stop rook d1? I thought to myself, can I play king c1, which seems the most natural potentially, because otherwise there's these possibilities of the piece moving in, and he's harassing the f2 pawn, and I was looking at what happens when he takes the a2 pawn. But here I go check, whichever square you go to, king moves over, then I do check again, whichever square the king moves over to, then I pick up the rook. So that doesn't work. But nevertheless, I opted for a lot simpler option, and I just played rook c to d7. Basically just says, okay, well, if you want to try to do something, you're going to have to defend this pawn, and either way, I'm just going to win it, and now there's no more back rank checkmate, and then here my opponent resigned. So let's move on to the next one. This is where I had the black pieces, and I'm just going to skip forward to the really important part. This is just a kind of Old Benoni open, very, very normal. Supposed to play knight c6, but it matters not. Get all our pieces out. I'm never really worried about knight here because what I'm just going to do is I'm going to move back, then I'll play the a pawn, and then it's all fine. And I kind of want to play a6 anyways, so I might as well let it come with tempo, but, you know, only so far. Okay, and now both of us have got most of our pieces out. We both have kind of a bad bishop that's stuck behind same colored pawns. His is probably a little bit better than mine, and his pieces are a little bit more active, so I'd rather have him. I don't know why I traded off to give him such a big center and an open e-file, but life goes on. And part of the reason is because I saw this silly tactic, and I thought to myself, okay, well, if you take with the pawn, I'm going to pick up the knight, so you can't do that. If you take with the knight, I'm going to take with the knight. You take back with the pawn, and then I'm going to pick up the d pawn. And that comes with the threat if you got to do something about this bishop or this rook, you have to move it to one of these two squares. There's no other squares, and this pawn is weak, and my pieces are maybe a little bit more active than they were before. So in this position, what's essentially forced is that you have to play pawn to c5. Now, I thought this was a good position, but I didn't see the threat, which the engine tells me now is a 4.75 threat in my favor. You start with knight to g4. Now, obviously, you can't take the knight with the queen because my bishop defends, but what's the threat? Well, there's multiple threats here. If you do nothing, let's just say you make a random move. Okay, I'm going to take here with check. You move over, take, move over. I take with another pawn, and then now I'm up 2 pawns. Your king does not belong here, and all your pieces are stuck over here on the other side of the board. And so the only move you can really play to stop it is g3, but now you have to make an even uglier decision. I'm going to play bishop takes d4, and now you have 2 problems. One, I'm double attacking this f2 pawn, and this knight is absolutely under no protection. And even worse is you don't have the great in-between move. You might want to move the pawn forward, and then I take the knight, you take the knight, and I go, oh, maybe it's equal. The problem is this is pinned. And if you can find a piece that defends both of these squares, you are a great chess player. And unfortunately, the only one that does that doesn't actually do it, because at the same time, it does defend both pieces. You obviously cannot take the bishop on f2. So I missed all of that and just played some nonsense, and so it was a huge missed win. We reached this really complicated position, and thankfully I can play d6, and you're not in time to take the pawn here, because after we trade off the knights, pieces are defended. We move forward, trade some pieces off, and I make a huge mistake here that thankfully doesn't stop me, and I take the pawn. Now you might think, well, what's the problem? Takes, and now you get a weak pawn on a4. What's the problem there? The problem is after the original move takes, you have queen to e2, and the problem is if I move my queen away, I can't defend the rook, so the only position I can really afford is takes, which is actually a brilliant move, but it doesn't feel that way. And then rook takes b1, and technically speaking, I'm actually up material here, but this feels like a really hard game to play. This e-pawn is very tender, and I'm going to have to be very careful with it, and eventually white's probably just going to blast over and destroy me. So thankfully he takes, doesn't take advantage of that. This is just a pawn blunder. I didn't realize that I couldn't play that move, but it works out because I go after the a pawn, and there's really no way to defend it. If you move the bishop down here, I move my bishop up here. And if you move your bishop up here, I move my bishop down here. And so the problem is that even in the ensuing position, if you say, well, I can get one more defender on this with the rook, the problem is I just start marching that d-pawn, and there's just no way to stop it. You're going to sacrifice the rook for the exchange and a pawn, which isn't terrible, but eventually I'm going to win this game. And so once we got to this position, my opponent resigned. And let's move on to my other games with Code Punisher 69. Okay, so this game is going to go by in just a moment, so don't blink or it'll be gone. Starts with mainline Caro-Kahn advanced variation. We get h4, h5. Obviously, you have to play h5 or h6 here realistically if you want to fight for an advantage, because let's just say you play the very normal move, pawn to e6. The problem is the g-pawn comes crashing through, and there's no way to avoid not losing the bishop. And you might be able to throw in a move like bishop e4 so that you can elicit this semi-weakness of putting your pawn on f3, because maybe you want your knight to go there. But at the end of the day, it's still pretty bad, and you're not going to get more than a pawn for it. There's nothing good to say about this position. So you have to play h6 or h5. And then in this position, that's a terrible move because I'm just up a pawn temporarily. And if I can keep the pressure on, I'll keep that pawn. There's actually a really cool position here where if you want to, you should not do it. You can take, because after pawn takes back, you pick up the rook. This knight is under attack. There's only two moves that defend it, either moving the king over or moving the king up to d2, but d2 doesn't seem like a great idea, and so you just move the king over, and then I move back to guard this pawn. And then theoretically, maybe long-term, I'll be able to go after that pawn, or I can do a slightly different variation. I can go back here, and after takes, we are equal material, but the rook probably doesn't belong on f5 to the point where the engine says you should actually just take back with the pawn. But that is some nonsense, so I said no thank you. And instead of doing that, I just played queen to b6, which has the threat of this b-pawn. And the problem is there's not really a great way to defend it. One of the better ways is basically a complex variation where you sacrifice a pawn because it's a poison pawn. You move your queen up, and if I take, then you move your rook over, and you'll lose the b-pawn, and that'll be a little bit worse for black there. And so one of the common moves, which is really complicated, is after you play knight a4, there's no check that wins the knight because you can just move back or guard here. But after a5, you actually can play a really interesting move, c3, because the queen defends the knight. And you might think the knight's almost trapped after b5, but knight goes to c5, takes. And the problem is this is really, really good for me because I've still got that extra pawn. So if I can keep the pressure up with a move like b5, and after takes, that doesn't work, obviously, because I pick up another pawn. I'm up 2 pawns. And even if I don't play a move like b5, I can play a move like a knight or a queen to c7. And the problem is I'm still in a position where if you go after that pawn, I'll be in time to win another one. And then there's just nothing good to say about this particular situation. And I'm still going to be up a pawn. And then there's a lot of just wildness that ensues. But unfortunately for my opponent, they played b3. And that allows me to play bishop b4. And the problem is there's just no good way to defend it. If you defend with the queen, I play queen to a5, and there's no way to defend the piece anymore. You're just going to lose a piece, if not more. If you defend with the bishop, then I can play queen takes d4. And the problem is, while this position is incredibly complicated, you can do a really interesting line that I probably wouldn't have found the best move to after knight in the corner. I pick up the rook, you pick up the bishop, and technically I'm just up an exchange here, but since I'm going to pick up the e-pawn, I'm up more than an exchange, and it's up actually 5 points of material. And if you play this move and I want to take things differently after you move here, I can actually take on d2 with check. If you take with the queen, I pick up the rook, so you can't do that. So you have to pick up with the knight, but then I would not have found this move in the game. The very, very crazy move, bishop takes c2. And the problem is if you take this bishop, I pick up the rook in the corner. And if you don't take the bishop and you move over here, the problem is I can then just go pick up this e-pawn, which incidentally defends the g-pawn because you can't move the bishop. And you still cannot take this bishop because I'll take the rook with check. And you can't even move the rook out of this position. It's really, really ugly. And if I had found those moves, it would have been for a really interesting game. But unfortunately for my opponent, they paid a really unfortunate move, which is king to d2, and that comes with check, and there's just no way out of it. If you move back here, I take with check first, and if you move over, takes. Not only am I up a piece, but I'm also up an exchange, which is pretty tough to be in. And if you move over here, then I can start with, I can just take this if I want to, but I can also do check, move over, then takes. I'm threatening checkmate, and the only move that stops it, obviously, because you can't sacrifice your queen, is bishop back here, but this just felt pretty good for me. So, all that to say, they move their bishop up, but I can still hit them with bishop takes c3 check, and it's just the same position. I'm going to win more material, though, because you don't have the open line here between the rooks, and so it's even worse. And at this point, my opponent resigned. And let's move on to the next one. This was a player from the Arlington Chess Club who challenged me, and so they were a couple of really fun games. This one I'll kind of skip to the more important. This one game was going to be an e4 game, but after they played g6, I just said, why don't I just take d4? And then once they played bishop to g6 or g7, I just said, screw it, let's just do c4, d4, e4. Game goes on. Pretty happy with how it turned out. Especially the way they kind of let me close down everything. Especially in this position, I was super happy to finally play b5 because it basically means there's never any ability of black to break through on the king side. In these kind of positions, usually white tries to checkmate black and black tries to blast through on the king side, especially in lines, in the c4, d4 lines, when white castles queen side. But in this position, I'm never worried about it. So now my king really is honestly super safe. Even in this position, it's safe, but also if I got my king over here, I have tons of room to amass all my pieces on the king side and go for a pretty quick checkmate. Trade off the bishops to get rid of that strong dark squared bishop. And here I played knight to h2. I can't really play the really nice move knight to g4, but this allows me to push the f pawn and theoretically break the board open. Now here I missed an awesome tactic after moving my rook over, which I almost saw. I mean, based on the moves I play, you might think I found it, but after you play f takes e5, you have to do something about this knight, and if you take here, there's an awesome tactic, rook takes f6. And obviously the problem is if you take with the king, I pick up the rook for absolutely free, and if you don't take up with the king, then I've just got a piece for nothing. And so unfortunately, I missed that, though, and so I almost saw it. Instead of playing the correct move, I played queen to g5. Now, the best move here is just to move your king, or move your queen back to defend it, but instead of that, they move the knight back, which allowed me to take on e5 with check. They move the king back, and now I have another double threat. I move the queen back to f4, and the problem is I'm attacking this pawn, and I'm attacking this rook, and there's no way to defend them both. If you move forward with the king, that obviously doesn't work because I take here, and then it's not quite checkmate yet, but it's getting pretty ugly. And the other problem is your rook's under attack, so you have to find a way to defend the rooks. The engine says best move here, besides king g7, and besides the even crazier move, just sacrificing a full piece by taking d5, is playing the move g5. And that basically says, okay, well, you take with check, but, you know, at least my rook's still intact. Unfortunately, my opponent missed that, so I take the rook for free. Now the game got a little bit simpler. I decided to move my rooks in, and it's really kind of an ugly position. And once he moved his knight away, I felt finally like I could go after that g6 pawn. And here, there's a bit of a position where I started to worry, and so the reason behind playing bishop f3, besides the fact that it forces the bishop trade, is because I specifically wanted to force the bishop trade. I was worried about a lot of positions where if my bishop's not there, and if white or black plays a move like rook to g8, I'm going to get in a really ugly position with a lot of discovered checks on repeat where he just picks up all my pieces. So I said, screw it, let's get rid of the bishops first, and now when rook g8 comes, there's just no threat. I can move the queen out of the way, or I can go for the crazy line, which is if you decide to take the queen first, I take your queen, and there's actually no way to stop the passed pawn. So obviously if you take here, I would just take the rook and move forward. But even if you don't do that, and you try to do something like this, well then I don't have to take the piece first, I can just promote with check. And so obviously you can't really do that, and so in this position, black took, then I took with check, then I took, and then I move the knights forward. And I'm okay to trade pieces off, because if I trade pieces off, I'm up a rook, and I can make that work. And here I realized after knight g5 that I've got a lot of coverage of the back rank. And so my knight covers these two squares, my pawn covers these squares. So right now, all of these squares are covered, which basically means there's a back rank checkmate coming. So I start with the move, knight to g7 check. The rook covers this line, the pawn covers these two squares, the knight covers these two squares, so the only legal move is king to d8. Then I finally come in with the check, and now again, the knight covers all these squares, the pawn covers these squares, and the knight covers this square, and unfortunately you can't actually keep escaping to c8, so you have to play the knight back, and then finally I take on e8 with checkmate. And I don't think I've ever gotten a position where I've had a rook on the back rank defended by a knight on the 7th rank, while my other knight and pawn were doing double duty, making it so it was a back rank checkmate. I thought that was a super interesting position. Hope you guys enjoyed the video, and that's all for this one.